I'm Petra Andries. I'm an associate professor at Ghent University, and I'm going to talk a bit about a paper that was published in Strategic Entrepreneurship Journal. It's called Simultaneous Experimentation as a Learning Strategy, and we look at business model development under uncertainty. So we know that many entrepreneurs are confronted with high degrees of uncertainty. Some of them develop really radical technologies which they're trying to commercialize, but often they don't know where the market is, they don't know what customers want, they don't know what kind of revenue models to use, etc., etc. And with this study, we really wanted to understand how entrepreneurs under such uncertain circumstances are able to search for and identify a viable business model. We've been doing qualitative research to get at this research question, and we see different approaches that ventures can take to try and identify this viable business model. On the one hand, we see that some ventures really commit very early to one specific business model, and they try to make this work. So they get a lot of investors on board to fund quite expensive marketing campaigns, etc. They also hire people with specific skills that fit this one specific business model, and they try to develop it over time. But in all the cases in our study that followed this approach, we actually see that it doesn't work. After 2 or 3 years, it turns out that the initial choice, the initial business model, is not viable. And what the ventures then need to do is they need to pivot and find a new business model. And we see that that's a problem because they've really organized in such a way that it becomes difficult to change. So they have these dedicated employees that really want to work on that specific thing. They also have these investors that really bought into this initial idea, which makes it very tricky for the organization to make this switch. And all of the ventures in our study that chose this approach, actually, they are dissolved or they go bankrupt. Quite interestingly, we see also another approach. We see several ventures in the study that instead of focusing from the very start on one specific business model, they develop actually a portfolio of business models. So they develop a portfolio of parallel experiments with different business models, and then they gradually narrow that down over a period of several years until they end up with one business model that really works. And they also do this in a really smart way. So we see that if you look at one individual business model experiment in this whole portfolio, it always overlaps to some extent with another business model in the portfolio. But because there are so many different business model experiments, it means that even with quite overlapping business model experiments, they still are able to cover a really broad range of interesting ideas. And it allows them to learn from these different experiments and end up in the end with the most promising one. And you see that they also organize accordingly. So instead of really getting dedicated people that fit it with this one idea, they organize in a more project-based manner, and they are much more flexible in allocating people to different tasks. And the investors actually buy in. That's also interesting to see. So the investors really appreciate and even support this parallel experimentation. But we do see a difference. Instead of giving large amounts of funding up front, they do this more in a stage-based approach. As the company progresses and develops the portfolio further, we see that the investors add in extra chunks of investments. And we see that actually these companies are doing well. The ones in our study, they all ended up identifying a really interesting business model, and they actually became world leaders in their market niche. So it seems that maybe in the short term, this focused commitment allows you to grow quicker. But our study really shows that in the longer term, it makes more sense to take a little bit more time in the beginning, develop this portfolio, and then you might ending up with a much more promising business model in the end. I think it's quite interesting to see that the paper has been capturing attention by a variety of scholars. So it's been picked up in entrepreneurship literature by people trying to understand how new ventures are started up and evolve and are able to also thrive in these uncertain circumstances. But we see that the paper is also being referred to by innovation scholars who look at business model innovation in established companies. And in particular, we also see an interest in scholars looking at responsibility responsible business models in entrepreneurship journals, but also in journals that deal with environmental issues, for example. We know a bit more now about how entrepreneurs deal with uncertainty and look for business models or market applications, which is also interesting to look at. But there's still much more to see. The paper has been published in 2013, but it relies on some older data. And I think if we look at the environment, a lot has changed. So, for example, if you look at how the internet is now being used by entrepreneurs who are trying to get an idea of the interests of the market in their technologies. The question is, for example, how can you make use of the crowd to get new ideas for where to apply your technology, where a potential market could be. So, for example, this is something I'm really interested in. How does this play a role in the search process of entrepreneurs when looking for interesting business models or interesting market applications for their technology? It's really nice to receive recognition for this work. I started doing this work during my PhD, which is a long time ago. I was at a university where there was more focus on quantitative work, and people were not always so supportive. So it's really nice to see so many years later that the paper and the work is being appreciated, and that scholars really think that it's worthwhile to look at and that it has made an impact on the field.